Hello, hello, hello. This is Chris Ferdinandi from GoMakeThings.com. And today we are going to take a server rendered form and we're going to make it Ajaxy using an HTML web component. So if you watched my last video, we built out a PHP rendered UI that uses some flat JSON and a PHP based API to update the UI, add some stuff to a list. And it works great without any JavaScript. But today we're going to take that and we're going to enhance it so that you get a more Ajaxy app-like experience when JavaScript is actually supported. So if you missed last week's, let's quickly just kind of review how that all works. I will drop a link somewhere up here that links to that video if you want to go watch it. But if not, let's just give you the 30-second summary. So I have a form here where you can add items, and when you add them, they show up here. If we jump in and look at the HTML, we have, it's actually an index.php file that is grabbing some stuff from a JSON file. If it's empty, it shows the message that we're seeing on screen right now. If not, it displays a list of items. And then we have a form that when it's submitted, sends or posts all its data to this additem.php file. If we look at that file, it is grabbing the request that comes from the user. It's getting this file called items. It's saving whatever data the user submitted to it. And then it is sending back a response with a message. Under the hood, the send response method, that's in a helper file that will be in this source code down in the show notes, or down in the video description rather. But that function redirects the user to whatever we pass in as a redirect. And it also appends this message as a query string so that over in our PHP file, we can grab it and display it in the UI. And the data that gets added, it gets injected into this items.json file that lives on the server somewhere, but cannot be accessed publicly. So just as an example, right? Let's say we want to buy, I want to buy some apples. I'm going to add item and, oh, sorry. I still had the JavaScript version here. Let's redo that. So we'll delete that. We'll reload this. So we're going to say buy apples. And I don't know if you can see this, but the status message here now, up in the URL bar, I've got message equals item added to the list, and it has a success status of true, and it's displayed in the UI, and our list displayed the update. So this absolutely works, but in a larger application, you might not necessarily want to do the full page reload process every time someone submits a thing. You might want to just keep them where they are on the page and handle it with JavaScript. So today we're going to look at how to actually do that. Real quick before we dive in, I just wanted to mention that this video and others like it are made possible thanks to the generous support of my Go Make Things members. A recurring membership helps me create more videos like this and also gets you some cool perks. If that's something you're interested in, you can learn more at gomakethings.com/join. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the end of the video, but I did want to mention it. Just, if you're enjoying this, I would appreciate if you headed over and subscribed. Similarly, if you like this video, you have like thoughts, questions, comments, whatever, please leave them down in the comments. Subscribe, share, like, all that good stuff. YouTube loves it. Makes me happy. I hate that I have to shill this shit. I'm so sorry. Let's dive back into the video. So we want to make this Ajaxy. So what I am going to do is I am going to use a custom web component. So we're going to wrap this whole thing in the Ajax form web component. And then we're going to load a script. So script source equals, and then we're going to load ajaxform.js. And we'll dive over to that file and take a look at how it works. So like any web component, we're defining a custom element, passing in the name, and then a class that extends the HTML element object. And inside that class, I have a constructor. The first thing it's going to do is call super. Because this is extending another class, we need to do this to make sure we inherit those classes' properties and methods and all that. Then we want to grab a whole bunch of stuff. So I want to make sure that we have a form status element to add our messages to. So I'm going to use the query selector method scoped on this. So inside a web component class, this refers to both the instance and the element that it was instantiated on. So if I'm using an element method, this will refer to the DOM element. If I'm using one of the class methods, it will refer to the instance. So we're going to get the role equals status element. That's where we are displaying those status messages. And if for some reason one doesn't exist, we'll use the document create element method to create one and give it that role status attribute on it. I'm also going to get the form element, which is really important because we want to intercept it when it submits. And I'm going to append that role equals status element into the form. This is useful for two reasons. One, if we just created it, if it didn't exist, that gets it in the UI. But there are situations, depending on how like your rendering tool works, where this status element might actually be like outside the form for some reason, and this just puts it back inside where it belongs. I think this is probably more a me problem. There's a good chance you might be able to skip this, but I have it in the code. It's how things work in my static site generator. And then I have a whole bunch of different options that you can use to customize how this thing works. So one of them is the message that shows up when the item is submitting. So by default, it'll say submitting, but you could change it to anything you want. So for example, maybe we want this to say, because this is adding an item, right? We might say adding your item to the list. And that's what will get displayed instead of submitting. Message disappear, we would include on the element if we want the message to automatically disappear after a period of time. I have it set to 6 seconds or 6,000 milliseconds. If you want to keep the fields, instead of having them automatically wiped after the form submits, you can use the keep fields attribute. If there's an update URL attribute, this will actually, when we get back a successful response, it'll use the history API to update the URL without reloading the page. And then the remove attribute, if this is present, you would include a selector, and it will remove that selector entirely after the form. So after the form is successfully submitted. So for example, imagine this was inside some sort of like bigger other element, right? Like div, some sort of like element here that let's give it a class, right? Like self-destruct, right? Some sort of component that after you submit, it goes away. Maybe it's like to delete a thing, right? So once that thing's done, you want to delete it. You could add remove equals and then any sort of selector. So this, this would accept classes, IDs, complex selectors. If you want to use attribute selectors, that's fine too. But the idea is the script AJAX form will look for a parent element that has the selector and then automatically remove it after the element is successfully, or after the form rather is successfully submitted. And finally, delay. So if you want to delay how long, or if you want to delay the ability to make future submits, you would add the delay attribute, and it'll make the person wait 6,000 milliseconds or 6 seconds before they can submit the form again. This is useful if you want to prevent like rapid submissions of a thing. Otherwise, it defaults to 0, no delay. So once we get all these attributes and we save them, we are going to listen for submit events on the form, and I'm going to pass in this, which will automatically run the handle event method for me. Handle event is a really fun a really fun thing you can do with the add event listener method. So if you're unfamiliar with this, with add event listener, if you normally would pass in a callback function, but if you pass in an object and that object has the handle event property on it, it will automatically run in response to that event being triggered and receive the event object as an argument. And because classes are objects, we can pass in the instance class and handle event will run. And this is useful because when we do this, we get access to the instance and all its properties. We don't have to do any sort of kind of binding or arrow function silliness. We can just use functions the way we normally would. And in here, I'm doing a little trick where I am getting the event type and running a dedicated method. This is kind of silly here because we really only have one event, but if we had multiple events, this would be probably a little bit more useful. One of the reasons I am doing it this way, though, is because for form submissions, I want to be able to use async and await. And when I was trying to run handle event as an async function, it just wasn't working the way I expected it to. So this kind of got me around that. So we've got our onSubmit method. This is going to run whenever the form submits. And actually, let's just pause here for a second. We are going to, we'll see this in action, right? So we'll say submitting, and then we'll return so that nothing else happens. And if we jump over to the browser and we can clear out that status message now. So we are going to say testing, and it added the item to the list. That's really weird. Why did it do that? Yeah, it should have returned without doing anything else. So what did I do? Did it get cached? It probably did. Disable cache. Let's try that again. All right. Testing. Yeah, there we go. That's better. So submitting, and nothing else happens. So you can see now, instead of going to the server, our web component is hijacking that return. So, or hijacking the form submit rather. So the next thing we want to do is check to see if the form is already submitting and we haven't gotten a response back from the API. If so, we want to do nothing. So I have a couple of helper functions to do this for me. One of them is disabled, and the other is disable. So the first one is going to check if the form is already submitting, and the other one is going to then set it to a disabled state. Just to show you what those do, when the form is submitting, I am adding a form submitting attribute. When I'm done and I enable the form back again, I remove that attribute, and to check if it's disabled, I'm going to look for that attribute. Now, I could have just saved this as an instance property, but the reason I like to do it this way is that you can then hook into that to style the form differently. So for example, I could do something like form is submitting button, and then I could make the button, I could do something like set its opacity to 0.7, and now the button will look like it's disabled without me having to disable the button, which for accessibility reasons, you generally want to avoid because it messes with focus and creates some problems for screen reader users. So we check if the form is disabled. If it is, we quit early. If it's not disabled, we're going to disable it, and then we're going to keep working. So the next thing we're going to do is show our status message. And for this, I have a show status method on my class. We're going to pass in whatever that message submitting property was. So either just the word submitting, or if the user provided an option for this as an attribute on the web component, we'll use that instead. And true means that it is not an error. So it's a success status. And if we look at the show status method, it accepts a message, this the success attribute, and if the form is done, so not just this is not an error, but we're completely done, it gets a property of complete. It's going to set the inner HTML of the announce element to the message, and it's also going to add a conditional class depending on whether it was a success or an error. There's some other stuff going on in here too. We'll talk about toast a little bit later. If the message is supposed to disappear, and it's a success message, then I set timeout, and after 6 seconds, I wipe out the content and remove the class. So let's jump back over here for a second, and we will again return just to end early. So we'll reload the page, and then we'll go, how about this? And you can see now our message, adding your item to the list, but it does not show submitting. It shows our custom message. One other thing, if you wanted to see it in action, we could try the message disappear attribute, which is simply like it's either on or it's not. So if we jump down here, we can say message disappear, and we'll reload the page and trying again. And after 6 seconds, this will just disappear from the UI. Or it should if I had properly reloaded the script, but I didn't. So we're going to move on rather than repeating this here. So we'll get rid of that. All right. So now we're ready to actually call the API. This is the fun part. So I wrap the whole thing in a try catch, and finally, and then I am going to get the action and method from the form. So you'll remember the action is where the form is supposed to submit to, and the method is the API or the method request that you want to use. In this case, it's post. And then I am going to use the fetch method to actually call that API endpoint, passing in the method, the body, which I'm going to use a serialize helper function to get, and then some headers. The first is the content type, which is a form URL encoded type. And the next one is the X requested with XML HTTP request. If you watched my last video, you'll know that this is what I use to check if the request is AJAX and not a server submit. So if HTTP X requested with exists and has that value, it's an AJAX request, not a full form reload, and we're going to respond differently. So that's really important to have on there. Once we get back a response, I'm going to await and get the JSON data from that response. If there's an error, I'm going to throw that data. Otherwise, I am going to check if there's a message, and if there is, I'm going to display it as a status message. If there's an update URL that I'm supposed to run, I'm going to use the history replace state method to update the URL. And if the response sent back a URL that I'm supposed to redirect to, I'm going to use the location href property to redirect the browser to that URL. Finally, if I'm supposed to keep the form fields, or if I'm not supposed to keep the form fields rather, so most cases, I'm going to run the reset method on the element, and that's going to wipe all of the forms. I will show you that in a minute. Actually, let's just jump over there now. So if we jump to reset, it's running this form reset. It probably doesn't need to be a helper function. It just is. And then we're going to emit a custom event. So if we jump down to emit, I am passing in a detail object. In this case, it's the actual form response data. And then I'm creating a custom AJAX form event. It bubbles. It's not cancelable. It includes the detail, and I'm dispatching it on the custom element. This is going to be really useful for updating this list. We're going to cover this in the next video, the third video in this series, but the whole point of this is to allow other parts of the UI to respond to the form successfully submitting some stuff. So I will walk through when we might actually use that in the next video. But for today, just know that we're emitting it. And then optionally, if the element is supposed to get removed, if there's a remove element property, I'm going to look for the closest element. If one doesn't exist, I'm just going to grab the element itself, and then I'm going to remove it. If there's an error, I'm going to show the error. Either way, whether there's an error or a success message, I'm going to re-enable the form. And if any sort of delay was provided, like if we were flagged to delay resubmits, I'm going to pass that in. So I'm using the set timeout method. If there's no delay, this will be 0 and this will run immediately. If there is a delay, this will run for 6,000 milliseconds, 6 seconds, and then re-enable the form. So one other thing I mentioned was the toast. So if the content is getting removed and the form was successfully completed and it's a success message, not just a complete. I said that in reverse. Hopefully you know what I meant. I am going to run the toast method. And what this does is it gets a wrapper element with a toast wrapper class. If one doesn't exist, it creates one and appends it to the end of the body. And then it replaces my role equals status element, the announce element, with the toast class and moves it into the beginning of that toast wrapper and then automatically removes it after 6 seconds. So where this is useful is if this form completely went away, you wouldn't have a place to show that status message. So you can display it down at the bottom as like a toast that pops up and then disappears after a short period of time. Let's actually see this all in action now. So if I jump back over to the browser and reload everything, we are going to, let's make sure our network actually cleared everything out. And then we will add, let's see, we've got buy apples, let's say bake an apple pie. Cool. So item was added to the list. You can see my focus is still on the form fields. The one thing that hasn't happened is my UI hasn't updated. I actually have to update the browser for that to happen. So in our next video, we're going to look at how you make this part Ajaxy 2, again, without having to reload the whole page. Real quick before we go, I recently decided to stop selling expensive courses that most folks can only afford with a corporate training budget and focus on creating more excellent free content, including YouTube videos like this one. A recurring Go Make Things membership helps me create more videos like this and also get you some cool perks like access to my private Discord community and my personal collection of courses, guides, and code snippets. There are a range of membership levels available and they all get the same perks. Even $3 a month really helps keep this channel going. If you head over to gomakethings.com/join, it'll take you to the site where you can learn more and sign up. One thing I did want to point out is there's this whole toolkit section that has a bunch of web components pre-made, ones that I actually use on my projects all the time. One of them is the Ajax HTML component, or the Ajax form component rather, that we looked at today. You can download the source code. It comes with complete documentation and examples, tips on how to style things. So if this was something you were kind of interested in digging deeper into, might be a great thing for you to check out. And if not, no worries too. I'm just happy you're here. I will see you next week where we will look at how to make this portion update when the form is successfully submitted. And until then, have a wonderful week. Cheers.